When parents bring home a newborn baby, they instinctively turn to loving, nurturing, and protecting their child while also grappling with the weight of their new responsibilities. However, there are rare circumstances where some parents seemingly don't develop these instincts and put their own wants above the needs of their child. For parents Cortney Bell and Christopher McNabb, these wants included a severe meth addiction, and unfortunately, their 2-week-old daughter Caliyah suffered as a result. After Caliyah was reported missing from their home on October 7, 2017, this case quickly went viral due to Chris and Cortney's bizarre behavior and the disturbing details that would come to light during the investigation. This case deals with topics ranging from addiction and domestic violence to incest and potential murder, and it's one that will undoubtedly leave you feeling angry. However, when children have to endure things like this in their everyday lives, the least we can do as a society is listen to their story. To understand what happened to baby Caliyah as well as the unexpected updates in this case, we need to go behind the headlines. Every child is born with endless possibilities on how their life will unfold. But when Caliyah Claire McNabb was born on September 23, 2017, the odds were already stacked against her. Born 1 month premature, she was only 5 pounds when she left the hospital with her parents, Chris McNabb and Cortney Bell. Instead of being taken to a safe, clean, and loving home, she was immediately dropped into a world of dysfunction, to say the least. You see, Chris and Cortney weren't only Caliyah's parents, they were also first cousins, but that's just the tip of the dysfunctional iceberg. Christopher McNabb was born on March 23, 1990 to parents Michael McNabb and Donna Davis, but was raised primarily by his dad and his stepmother, Crystal, in Cartersville, Georgia. While most parents try to see the best in their children, the same couldn't really be said for Chris's parents, with Donna even referring to him as a child from hell. From a young age, Chris had behavior problems and started on his track of becoming a menace to society before he even reached high school. At just 15 years old, he was charged with criminal trespassing and possession of stolen property after he broke into a house. Due to his age, he only received a slap on the wrist, but as his father tried to rein in his behavior, Chris just pulled further and further away. He would constantly leave home and be found days later in seedy hotels using drugs, and at one point even stole $7,000 worth of jewelry from Crystal to feed his growing addiction. Chris and Michael ended up getting into physical altercations because he just didn't think his parents' rules applied to him at all. The police were called several times and Chris would be charged with battery, but no amount of time in jail seemed to influence or sway his behavior when he got out. By 17 years old, Chris had moved on to committing bigger crimes, and for some reason thought it would be a good idea to target one specific business on multiple occasions. At Woods Fabrication located in Taylorville, he stole a Ford F-350 truck and rammed it through the facility's chain link fence. For this, he was arrested on multiple charges, including 2 counts of theft by taking, criminal trespassing, criminal damage to property, theft of an automobile, and larceny. Later that same month, while out on bond, Chris decided to return to Woods and committed 2 additional break-ins. During the second incident, he stole a 1989 Ford truck, resulting in charges similar to his previous offense. During the third break-in, Ricky Woods, the owner of Woods Fabrication, contacted the police to report yet another burglary. This time, Chris broke into the garage and took a white 1964 Buick Skylark, which he again crashed through the gate. Honestly, how stupid do you gotta be to keep going back to the same place that you keep getting caught? Anyway, these actions just led to more charges of burglary, criminal trespassing, criminal damage to property, and theft by taking. Even though he was able to get away during the third incident, Chris was finally caught by police after attempting to return to Woods a 4th time. He would spend several years in prison before being released in June 2011. Immediately after his release, Chris jumped right back into committing robberies, breaking into houses, and even stealing things from people he knew. He did short stints in and out of jail over the next several years, but for some reason was never sent back to prison. But maybe if he had, everything that would transpire going forward could have been prevented. In 2013, Chris was introduced to a 20-year-old woman named Cortney Bell. This is when things get a little confusing, but stay with me, I got some visuals. Cortney Bell was born on March 23rd, 1993 to parents Tim Bell and Pamela Hamby. In a somewhat similar situation to Chris, as soon as Cortney was born, Pam Hamby walked away from the family. This gem of a woman had children with 5 different fathers, but only raised one of them. She'd leave the rest of her kids with their dads and really had no interest in being a parent. Tim Bell, on the other hand, did the best he could to provide a good life for Cortney and raised her with the help of his parents. Now, even though Pam would come around sometimes whenever she needed food or cigarettes, for some reason, Tim never mentioned to Cortney that Pam was actually her mom. In my opinion, he probably didn't want Cortney's feelings to get hurt over the fact that Pam wanted nothing to do with her. So he always just referred to her as a family friend. However, when Cortney was around 12 years old, she was rifling through her dad's truck and ended up finding an old hospital bracelet on the floorboard. It was for a baby and had Cortney's name on it, with the mother listed as Pam Hamby. That's how she learned who her mother actually was, but this knowledge didn't make Pam suddenly want to be involved in her life or anything, so Tim just continued raising her as a single dad. As she got older and started moving toward adulthood, Cortney tried to develop a relationship with Pam, but it was never like a traditional mother-daughter bond. Instead, they do things like smoke weed and meth together, and Pam always acted more like an immature friend than a maternal figure. In 2013, Cortney was over at Pam's house where she was introduced to a 23-year-old Chris McNabb. He was actually the son of Pam's brother, Michael McNabb, making Chris Pam's nephew. This also meant that Chris and Cortney were first cousins, but that fact didn't stop the sparks from flying between them. They've even described the situation as love at first sight and began dating almost immediately. Most of Chris and Cortney's family members were grossed out and embarrassed by this, and rightfully so. I mean, even though marrying your cousin is legal in 19 states, including Georgia, I think it's safe to say that it's generally frowned upon amongst, well, everyone. This didn't bother Chris and Cortney though, and they even laughed at jokes of being referred to as kissing cousins.
Brother, ugh.
Pam also didn't seem to find anything wrong with her daughter dating her nephew, and the reason for that might become more clear later on. However, Michael, Chris's dad especially, didn't approve of the relationship, but after Cortney got pregnant with their first child in 2014, he had no choice but to accept it. Besides the fact that they were first cousins, Chris and Cortney's relationship was toxic in a multitude of other ways as well. Not only were they both heavily addicted to drugs, but Chris never grew out of his immature, hot-tempered personality as he got older either. The mixture of meth and Chris's pre-existing anger management issues led to almost constantly arguing between the couple. These arguments would often turn physical, with Chris hitting Cortney on a regular basis, even when she was pregnant. He also had a hard time remaining faithful to her and would make fake Facebook profiles so that he could talk to other women behind her back. When Cortney found out about various women on the side, for some reason instead of holding Chris accountable, she would go and actually physically fight these women. Cortney's dad later went on to say that Chris had lowered her self-worth and confidence so much during the relationship, and it's obvious she was desperate to make things work with him, regardless of how he treated her.
He had her self-esteem so low that she felt like that
nobody would listen to her.
Right, yes sir, you know, that he was the only one that she could turn to, you know, and this was the outcome of it, you know.
She was hopeful that having a baby would make him settle down and transition into a fatherly role, but unfortunately, the complete opposite happened. During Cortney's pregnancy, Chris ended up being arrested again for multiple outstanding warrants out of Coweta in Fayette County. He ended up having to stay in jail for around a year and a half, missing the birth of their daughter, Clarissa, in February of 2015. During his time there, he decided to completely cover himself in really cringy and horribly executed jail tattoos, including on his neck and all over his face. Now, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people who have gotten tattoos in jail and prison, and they actually turn out pretty good. Also, nowadays, face tattoos aren't as taboo as they used to be, but Chris's were just not it. They basically solidified the type of life he was hoping to live. A lame wannabe gangster. While he was in jail, Cortney and Clarissa moved in with her father, Tim, and her grandparents. This was a stable and safe environment for them, but unfortunately when Chris got out in September of 2016, Cortney was waiting with open arms. With the help of Tim and government assistance, the couple was able to get their first home together in Covington, Georgia. They rented Lot 31 and the Eagle Point Mobile Home Park, and Cortney felt hopeful that with their own place they could start growing together as a family. For some reason, even though they weren't financially stable or even stable in their relationship, they thought it would be a good idea to bring another life into the world, and Cortney became pregnant with their second child. Besides the fact that Chris was abusive and addicted to meth, another thing that really concerned Tim and the other family members was the fact that they didn't even try to keep their trailer clean or remotely safe for the children. There's nothing wrong with mobile homes, and there are many people who've created beautiful living spaces regardless of the size. However, Chris and Cortney basically just trashed the inside of their trailer, leaving trash, clothes, drug paraphernalia, and just filth everywhere. The trailer had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area, and if they had taken the time to keep it tidy, that is more than enough space for a small family. Instead of making one of their bedrooms a room for Clarissa, with maybe a nursery area on one side, they just piled the extra junk into that room and had her sleeping on a mattress in the main bedroom with them. They also just stuck a bassinet in their bedroom in preparation for the baby. So you can imagine how cramped that space was. So even though Chris and Cortney had 9 months before the baby would arrive, They didn't spend any of that time trying to get their lives together. In fact, Chris just seemed to be going more out of control with the drug use, and even though Cortney wasn't using as much, the fact that she was using meth at all during her pregnancy is disgusting. Chris's dad also owned a successful pipe-laying business called Ditch Dock and offered him a job so he could start providing for his family. But Chris wasn't interested in working, and I'm really not sure how they plan on paying for their rent, buying diapers, or formula, or anything for that matter, especially since all the money he did get by hustling or other illegal means was going to drugs. Cortney's dad, Tim, also knew that they would need a safe form of transportation for Clarissa and the new baby when it arrived. So to help them out, he gave them one of his vehicles to use, which was an older PT Cruiser. So it's obvious there were people in their lives willing to help them out, but at some point they would need to start helping themselves. Even though their baby wasn't due until October, baby Caliyah McNabb made her entrance early on September 23, 2017. Since Cortney and Chris still hadn't done much preparation, Tim recruited a few ladies from the neighborhood to help clean up their trailer before they brought the baby home. Even though baby Caliyah was an absolutely perfect, precious angel, being born a month early did come with a few complications, and she was even more fragile than the average newborn. The doctors explained that she was born with a potential club foot, which could easily be treated by an orthopedic specialist, but she also had a high white blood cell count and needed to be kept in the hospital for 4 days to receive antibiotics. Just to explain how tiny Caliyah was, even though she was born at 5 pounds and 6 ounces, it's common for exclusively formula-fed babies to lose some weight at first. And by the time she was ready to leave the hospital, she was only 4 pounds and 9 ounces. Now, even if you don't have children, it's pretty common knowledge that the first few days, weeks, and sometimes even months after having a newborn is pretty challenging to say the least, but it's a beautiful experience. Most parents soak in all of the special moments, cuddling, holding, and being in awe of their new baby. Chris and Cortney were a little different though. And right after bringing her home on September 27th, their life of hopping between meth houses, arguing, and mayhem started right back up again. Just 4 days after Caliyah arrived home, Cortney drove over to another one of her cousins named Megan Sorrell's house. At the time, Cortney's phone was broken and she came over to ask to use Megan's phone and to let her see the baby Clarissa. However, during the visit, Cortney suddenly disappeared and left her 2 kids with Megan. So let's just take a pause. I don't know any parent with a newborn, let alone an 8-day-old preemie, who would just pawn their baby off on someone without warning. And it's not like Cortney was gone for an hour or two. She left Caliyah and Clarissa there for 2 days. Now, Megan knew the kind of life Cortney and Chris lived, and she just figured that they were off doing drugs or something. She'd typically be fine with watching a family member's kids, but can you imagine how much work an 8-day-old baby is when it's not even your child and you weren't expecting it to begin with? Not only that, but Megan had 4 children of her own and she quickly started to become overwhelmed. She decided to call her mom to vent about the situation, and Megan's mom ended up calling Cortney's dad, Tim, to tell him what was going on. Tim, who had hoped that Cortney and Chris would step it up as parents, was absolutely livid that they were off running around town again, not taking responsibility for their own kids and selfishly pawning them off on Megan like that. He was also upset that Cortney hadn't just called and asked him to take care of the kids, which he would have gladly done, but figured it was probably because Cortney knew he would be disappointed. Tim ended up driving over to Cortney and Chris's trailer to see if they were home, and was even more upset by what he saw. And the few days they'd been home from the hospital, the trailer was in even worse condition than it had been before the ladies came to help them clean up for the baby. One of the stipulations of Tim letting Cortney and Chris use the PT Cruiser was that they needed to be responsible, and they clearly weren't. Tim decided to take the car, which was parked outside, and used it to take Clarissa and Caliyah back to his house. Not long after that, Cortney showed back up to Megan's house ready to collect her kids, only to find out that Tim had taken them and the car. Instead of being, I don't know, thankful that someone was actually looking after her girls, Cortney was apparently furious, but not about what you would expect. She was mostly upset about the fact that her and Chris's ride around town was now gone, and actually had the audacity to call 911 to report her dad had taken her kids, even though she had essentially abandoned them with Megan.
So they just showed up at your cousin's house and took
Yes,
your kids?
ma'am. It's crazy.
And they didn't give you a reason why?
They said that they were taking my kids, that I had left them at my cousin's house for a whole day and a whole night, and I mean, I don't see an issue with that. My cousin has kids and they were playing over there.
When the police got involved in the situation, they could clearly see that at the moment, things between Cortney, Chris, and Tim were getting heated. They also took a look inside the trailer, which made them realize that the girls would be better off just staying with Tim for the time being, at least until everyone cooled off and until they could clean up the inside of the home. Now that Tim knew Cortney had been running around town and wasn't being responsible, he really wasn't comfortable with the girls living there in the trailer, especially with Chris. Cortney also had visible bruises during this time, and it was no secret that they had been getting into physical altercations again. However, Cortney wasn't even sure at that point whether or not Chris wanted to be involved anymore, because he had been off seeing other women. As many of these kinds of relationships go, 1 hour they would be arguing, and the next Chris would be professing his love for Cortney. So it was highly unlikely that he would actually be out of the picture for long. For whatever reason, Cortney seemed more desperate to get him to come home than she did her own children. But Chris was extremely angry at Tim for taking the PT Cruiser away. He even convinced Cortney to tell Tim that he could keep the girls as long as they could get the car back. And when that didn't work, Chris tried to come up with a plan for Cortney to sneak the car off of Tim's property, but thinking one step ahead, Tim had parked the car so that it was blocked in by his other vehicles. Ultimately, Tim did feel guilty for taking Cortney's kids away, especially because she had been trying to convince him that she was going to do better and that Chris wasn't going to be an issue. He agreed to return the girls to her as long as she cleaned up the trailer and made it suitable for the baby. On October 6th, after seeing that Cortney had made an effort to straighten things up, Tim brought Clarissa and Caliyah back along with diapers, formula, clothes, and everything they would need. This decision would unfortunately go on to haunt Tim Bell for the rest of his life. Just 1 day later, on the morning of October 7th, Chris and Cortney were woken up by Clarissa, who apparently was acting a little strange. She was sweaty, crying, and saying, "Sissy gone, Sissy gone." When Cortney got up to go check on Caliyah, she discovered that she was missing. According to Cortney, she had last seen Caliyah around 5 a.m. before she fell asleep on the couch with Chris, and they had looked everywhere in the trailer and asked all of their family and friends if they had seen her. All of that in itself is pretty bizarre considering Caliyah was only 2 weeks old. So it's not like she could hide by herself or be misplaced, and it's unlikely anyone in their lives would just come and take the baby in the middle of the night. However, even more bizarre than that was when the police arrived. Cortney said that Chris had run into the woods to look for Caliyah. Upon entering the home, even though Cortney had cleaned up, officers noticed that the trailer was still pretty cluttered. She said that while Caliyah's pacifier was on the floor, her baby blanket was missing, meaning that whoever had her must have taken it with them. Not only that, but again, Cortney had visible black eyes and was chain smoking cigarettes inside right in front of Clarissa, which sort of gave police just a taste of the type of situation they were getting involved with. Since Cortney had called her family and friends before calling 911, they started arriving at the home as well to try to help figure out what was going on. When Chris finally emerged from the woods, Tim Bell, who had been speaking to the police, pointed at him and said, "There's your guy." Now, even though at that point it wasn't clear whether Caliyah had been kidnapped or not, looking in the woods for a baby who can't even lift their head, let alone walk, is suspicious. After a preliminary search around the cluttered trailer and briefly speaking to everyone on the scene, a full-fledged search for baby Caliyah began, with Chris and Cortney being brought down to the station for questioning. Almost immediately, Chris began trying to think of anyone who may have wanted to hurt Caliyah or get back at him. And unfortunately, due to his lifestyle, Chris had more enemies than the average person. He started listing off people, including one man he had recently beaten up in the trailer, and then discarded the man's belongings in the woods in case the police came. He even tried to insinuate that Clarissa could have carried Caliyah off somewhere because she had tried picking her up in the past. And again, Clarissa was 2 years old. Chris mentioned that the night before, Clarissa went to bed between 8 and 9 p.m., but Caliyah was up throughout the night for feedings like a typical newborn. He wasn't exactly sure when she had her last feeding, but he guessed it was between 3 and 3:30 a.m. when Cortney thought it had been around 5 a.m. He said Caliyah had half a bottle during the last feeding and seemed fine afterward. After she went back to sleep, Chris went to the living room where he and Cortney had sex and then just fell asleep. And just a little side note, I'm pretty sure it's a medical rule that you aren't supposed to have sex for 6 weeks after giving birth, and it had only been 2 weeks. So that's a little yikes. But anyway, at around 9 a.m., he was awakened by a text from his dad, Michael, who said he'd send some money later on to help with their rent. After thanking his dad, Chris checked on the kids and saw they were still sleeping, so he went back to sleep on the couch with Cortney. It wasn't long after when Clarissa woke them and they discovered that Caliyah was gone. During Cortney's questioning, she explained that before they went to sleep, her cousin Craig Weatherford had come to visit and see the baby, and everything had been fine. After that, her story was basically the same as Chris's versions of events, and mentioned to the detectives that she was a light sleeper. She said she had no idea how she wouldn't have woken up to someone kidnapping Caliyah, especially considering that their trailer was so small. Back at the trailer park, professional and volunteer searchers began scouring the immediate area. Canines were brought in as well, but after the first night, there was still no signs of where Caliyah had been taken. After questioning them both separately, Cortney was brought into the interrogation room with Chris, and they were left alone to talk, seemingly unaware that they were being recorded. As soon as the detective stepped out, Chris took off his black and white hoodie and gave it to Cortney, who put it on and then began crying. They talked about where Caliyah might be, who could have taken her, and how cadaver dogs searching the house and the woods hadn't found her. At one point, Chris warned Cortney that the detectives would try to turn them against each other, and strangely started referring to Caliyah in the past tense. With no evidence to charge them, a few minutes later, the lead detective came back in to let Chris and Cortney know that they could return home. The search had been temporarily suspended and would resume the next morning. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be too much longer for everyone to find out what happened to Caliyah. When they got back to the trailer park, Chris made a brief statement to a news channel who had been called to the scene by Cortney's family to plead to the public for help.
Hey man, I don't know who got my kid, man, but I want my kid back, man. That's my child, man. I want my kid, man.
They ended up staying the night with their cousin Craig Weatherford and his wife and their children. It was during this time that Craig started to become a little suspicious about whether or not Chris had done something to Caliyah. The next morning on Sunday, October 8th, 2017, Cortney received a visit from her mother Pam at Craig's house. They hadn't spoken for about a year, but given the circumstances, Pam figured Cortney could use some support. Cortney and Chris rode with Pam to her house in Riverside to smoke, and Cortney spent time fixing her hair and makeup for a news interview with Channel 2. The group left the house in a car driven by Lauren Mackey, who was the girlfriend of one of Pam's sons. Pam sat in the passenger seat while Chris and Cortney sat in the back next to Lauren's toddler. While they were returning to the Eagle Point mobile home park from Riverside, Cortney received a text message from her cousin Craig almost at the exact same time as a phone call came in from her aunt Kim, Craig's mother. Although no one seems to remember the exact details of the phone call, they did inform Cortney that Caliyah had been found. It's not clear whether they said Caliyah was found dead or alive, but regardless, chaos erupted in the car. Later, Cortney said that when Kim informed her that Caliyah had been found, she felt a surge of hope that she might still be alive. However, Chris's reaction was much different. He began to panic, insisting that he was going to jail and that everyone was going to think he did it. Cortney asked him how he knew that Caliyah wasn't still alive, but he didn't answer her and said that he needed to get out of the car. Pam later recounted that as they were approaching the trailer park, she was concerned about the possibility of police being there with guns drawn. Since her grandson was in the car, she urged Chris to jump out as well. This only intensified the perception of Chris's guilt, because any normal parent would want to rush to their child's side, regardless if they had been found dead or alive. Chris jumped out of the car at an intersection and threw his phone on the ground in case the police were tracking him, and then made his way to a Chevron gas station to get a drink. In the gas station, employees later recalled him acting extremely strange for someone in his situation, and told him that his daughter had been found, but that he didn't do it. Cortney's behavior wasn't much better either, and she even asked Lauren to pull over in a known drug dealing area so that she could smoke meth before going to the scene. Instead of focusing on her daughter, her first priority was going to get her fix. Thankfully, Lauren, who had better sense and judgment, refused to stop and continue driving. Back at the trailer park, people had been searching for Caliyah all day when a neighbor came across a suspicious area in the woods. She discovered a log positioned over a hole in the ground that appeared unusual and out of place. Beneath the log, she noticed a collection of twigs and sticks when she spotted a black string under the sticks. She tugged on it and uncovered a blue Nike drawstring bag. She then instructed someone with her to notify the police. A deputy involved in the search near Henderson Mill Road went to the location where the bag had been found, which was around 900 yards from the trailer. It looked damp from the recent rain, but the deputy didn't believe it had been there for very long. He was soon joined by more investigators to assist him in opening the bag. Inside, they found several items of men's clothing, which were later confirmed to belong to Chris McNabb. As they moved the clothing, they noticed the top of an infant's head and ear peeking out from under a blanket. The child, later identified as Caliyah, was unfortunately deceased. When Cortney, Pam, and Lauren arrived at the trailer park, an officer asked Cortney if she or Chris were missing a backpack. She said that Chris had a bag she hadn't seen for a couple of days and described it as a Nike drawstring bag, blue on one side with a red logo and red on the other side with a blue logo. Cortney noted that Chris usually carried the bag with him at all times with extra clothes, but he hadn't had it in the past few days. She also told them about Chris jumping out of the car, saying, "They're going to blame me for everything," before running away. The officer issued a be on the lookout for Chris, who was found near the Chevron after the cashier called 911 to report his behavior in the store.
Incoming 911 with address of your emergency.
That guy that his baby was found dead is in the Chevron on 36.
Okay. Do you still have eyes on him?
Just let me step on the line. Okay, hold on one second. I know they're on the way. Is he still? Is he down? Is he running? Hello?
Newton County 911 emergency.
Yes, the guy y'all are looking for, he's in the store right here at 36.
We have a deputy that's in the area. Do you see our deputy?
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 right.
Okay, all right. If you'll just let them check it out.
Oh, there he is.
They got him.
After he was detained, Chris was interviewed again and said that when Kim called Cortney to inform her that Caliyah had been found, she repeatedly accused him of being responsible for Caliyah's death. Even though Kim denies ever saying that, this prompted Chris to jump out of the car in fear. He also admitted to using meth the night before Caliyah went missing. Due to the fact that 1, he ran, and 2, his daughter was found in his bag with his clothes, and that he had been the last person known to see Caliyah alive, Chris was charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and concealing the death of another. As the investigation progressed, the detectives concluded that Cortney's negligence contributed to Caliyah's murder, as she created an environment where her daughters were unsafe around Chris. As a result, 3 months after Chris's initial arrest, Cortney was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder, cruelty to children, and deprivation of a minor. Prosecutors decided to try Chris and Cortney together, and when the trial finally took place in 2019, it produced some of the most viral courtroom moments seen on YouTube. During the trial, one of Chris's old meth buddies testified that at 7:41 a.m., Chris messaged him and asked where he was and said that he was wigging and tripping and needed to get out of there, meaning the trailer. He then said that about an hour later, Chris messaged him again saying that he couldn't find the baby. Another woman testified that she had actually spoken to him on one of his secret Facebook accounts at around 9:42 a.m. These accounts don't really coincide with Chris's timeline of events that morning, because remember, he stated that he had been asleep when Clarissa woke him and Cortney up at around 10 a.m. During these types of trials, the most heartbreaking testimony often comes from the medical examiner, and this case was no different. Coincidentally, the medical examiner who worked on baby Caliyah is Dr. Laura Darisol, who also worked on the Jennifer Rosenbaum-Layla Daniel case we recently covered. During her testimony, she explained that after opening the Nike backpack, Caliyah was wrapped in a blood-stained baby blanket, and a wife-beater tank top was wrapped around her head. Caliyah was dressed in a little purple onesie with the words, "Stay away, boys. My daddy works out." She testified that her head was enlarged, and just by touch she could tell that there were broken bones of the skull. Underneath her right eye was a horizontal cut with clean edges, possibly due to a sharp object or the skin splitting during an impact. Obviously, we all know that when a baby is born, they don't have any teeth yet. However, when Dr. Darisol opened Caliyah's mouth, she had lacerations to her gums along the frenulum, or the little piece of skin in the center of the lip. This caused her baby teeth to actually push through her gums due to blunt force trauma. Her entire upper palate was also completely lacerated. There were numerous fractures of the skull, a bruise on the left and right cheeks, as well as along the jawline. Dr. Darisol said that Caliyah's head appeared misshapen and elongated due to palpable fractures, and when she did the internal exam, she discovered a large hole in the skull as well. There were also dozens of smaller fractures, with pieces of the bone only being held in place by thin, soft tissue. One of the hardest parts to listen to was the fact that Caliyah had suffered so much skull and brain damage that her brain essentially had been poured into a cup because it had lost all of its structural integrity. Dr. Darisol testified that Caliyah's cause of death was blunt impact injuries of the head, and the matter of death was homicide. In her opinion, the injuries could have come from a variety of things, such as stomping, hitting the head on a hard surface, striking with an object, or crushing. Over the course of the trial, the state called multiple witnesses who all painted a picture of Chris McNabb's character and the dysfunctional lifestyle he and Cortney were living. Even though it's obvious Cortney was being abused, she wasn't in the type of situation she couldn't get out of. In fact, there was evidence that proved she was actively chasing him after he blatantly told her to leave him alone.
Yeah, you chose me over our kids, so that's where you put my heart.
And what did she say?
She says, no, I haven't at all. And
before that, what did she say to him? I'm sorry, before the one that McNabb you read it that McNabb said.
Prior to that, she said, but I'll always love you. Till the day I die, I'll be in love with you. I'm just tired of you hitting on me and pushing me away when I know where your heart really is. Go to my kids. Don't chase me around. If you chase me and not go to them, I'll never be with you again. I put that on our kids.
And then up here, she's basically telling him, I don't want to be with you anymore. Is that right?
Yes.
The only time Chris ever seemed to actually be nice to her and want to stick together as a family is after Caliyah died and everyone was pointing the finger at him. He had always taken advantage of her loyalty before, and when it seemed like that was starting to fade, he could be heard screaming at her on the phone during jailhouse phone calls played in court. We also heard him say things like, "I love my babies, Cortney. All three of y'all. You know that. I know I did shit that I shouldn't have been doing, Cortney, but that's fucking dope, man. You know that dope does me like that. That dope fucks my head up, but it didn't fuck my head up bad enough to do some shit like that, Cortney. You know that." Chris was probably referring to the way meth can alter a person's personality, using it as an excuse for the way he treated her in the past. Mostly everyone has preconceived notions about meth, but online it's described as a powerful stimulant that affects the central nervous system, leading to increased energy, alertness, and euphoria. Users often experience heightened confidence and a decreased need for sleep, which can result in prolonged periods of being awake. Meth can also cause severe side effects like anxiety, paranoia, and aggression. Prolonged use can cause memory loss, emotional instability, and erratic behavior. Chris was definitely displaying several of these side effects. So even though he says meth couldn't make him hurt Caliyah, I don't think anyone actually believes that. He even told his friend he was wigging and tripping, so snapping on a potentially fussy newborn when you haven't slept, are paranoid, aggressive, and already have a hot temper isn't really hard to fathom. With all of the testimony and evidence present at trial, you can see why the defense in this case didn't really have much to work with. Chris's team even went so far as to say the main reason he was being charged with Caliyah's murder is because he has face tattoos. Yeah, face tattoos. Not because he was the last person to see Caliyah or because the fact that she was found in his bag, wrapped in his clothes in the woods where he's been known to ditch items before. No, the prosecution was just biased towards this loving father who just so happened to look a little rough around the edges. In their idiotic opinion, it's perfectly plausible that someone else broke into their trailer, gathered up Chris's items, murdered Caliyah, and then ditched her in the woods in order to get back at him for something and then framed him.
Is the police determined that their suspect was going to be somebody close to the child. Certainly, Chris McNabb and Cortney Bell are the closest one to the child. And they focused like a laser on Christopher McNabb as being the person who killed his daughter. In fact, they developed their whole case around the supposition and the hypothesis that Christopher McNabb is the one who killed his daughter. And you know why they did that. You know, look at him, look at the way he looks. Look at the fact that he had physical altercations with Cortney. Look at the fact that they did do drugs. Of course they're going to look at him. But pretty soon they realize they cannot prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And you're left with a difficult decision in this case because you're going to be, there's the evidence that you don't hear is much more important than the evidence that you do hear.
They tried to strengthen their argument with the fact that the cadaver dogs and the search team didn't locate Caliyah on the first day. So they think it's possible that someone had her and then placed her in the woods after the search was called off the first night. I'm really not sure why the dogs didn't locate Caliyah that first day, but it's actually not as uncommon as you might think for dogs to miss even a grown human body, let alone a tiny baby. I mentioned before that Cortney wasn't charged with directly murdering Caliyah, but for creating an environment where that could take place and for not protecting her children from Chris. Her defense argued that even though he was violent toward her in the past, he never displayed any physical violence toward the children. However, I think it's important to point out that Chris was barely even involved in Clarissa's life, and Caliyah was only 14 days old. He wasn't around the children long enough for anyone to know whether or not his violence could be directed toward them or not. And I think that what happened to Caliyah kind of proves that theory wrong. Given all of the evidence presented by the state in this case, it only took the jury just over an hour to find Chris McNabb and Cortney Bell guilty on all charges. While I mentioned that this case was highly publicized, it was the sentencing that went absolutely viral after more absolutely shocking information was presented about Chris and then his statement to the judge that really dug his own grave. Before the judge handed down his sentence, a psychologist who evaluated Chris a week after Caliyah's death had this to say.
He was probably an inch or two away from the glass, right in front of my face.
So were you separated by glass?
We were separated by glass.
And what did you see when he asked you to look?
He was wearing a turtle suit, which is something that prisoners are wearing when they're on suicide risk. And he wasn't wearing clothing under that, and he had pulled up the turtle suit and taken out his penis and was masturbating.
And did he masturbate to completion in your presence?
He did.
So, I think most people expected the psychologist to testify about Chris's state of mind, perhaps some mental issues he has that should have been taken into account during his sentencing, but No, just another example of debauchery, and I wish I could say I was surprised. It literally pops up on all top 10 craziest courtroom moments videos, and that was when the judge said, "You claim you're innocent, so tell me what sentence the man or woman that you claim did this should receive." And I'll just let you watch what happened from there.
I have a right to confront my witnesses who accuse me of doing wrong, so I felt like I wanted to say it in front of her since she was the one up here slandering me. And that's all I got to say.
You sure you don't want to talk about the sentencing and all of that? That was the only thing you wanted to tell the court?
I mean, I haven't heard anything about a sentence. I was just commenting on that. I understand
for the charges. And I just wanted to know if you had anything you wanted to say to the court.
I mean, I got a lot to say. I got a lot to say, but I'm not going to be able to say half of it.
I don't know, because I don't know what you're going to say.
I'm innocent. I didn't do it.
Okay.
I've maintained that the whole time. I feel like there was things that were allowed to be said that should have never been allowed to be said that didn't have nothing whatsoever to do with the case and what was being said. Just because somebody has domestic abuse issues with their spouse doesn't mean that they would put their hands on their kids, which has also been pretty much proved that I've never touched my kids in any harmful manner whatsoever. I've never harmed my kids. I didn't even hear anything that said that I had done anything to her in front of the kids. So that doesn't make sense either. And, you know, just to let the record show that I don't think I ever put my hands on her in front of those kids. And I just don't feel like just because somebody has domestic issues with the female in their life that they love, that they were just able to just say, oh, he don't love you and all that stuff just in front of everybody or whatever, which doesn't matter. But I just don't understand how you find somebody guilty of doing something to a 15-day-old baby because there was no evidence whatsoever that proved anything about me putting my hands on my kids. I've never done it. I never would. I don't believe in it. I was beat as a child, and I don't agree with it at all. And I would never do it. I would never do this. That's all I got to say. I would never do it. I'm innocent.
Well, I can make a lot of comments on what you said. I can make a lot of comments on the trial, but I know that was just be arguing with you or talking with you. I'll ask you one simple question. You claim you're innocent, so you tell me what sentence the man or woman that you claim did this should receive.
If you ever find out who did them, they deserve to be under the jail.
Okay, so they ought to get the maximum sentence.
Most definitely.
Okay. On the crime of malice murder, I sentence you to life in confinement without parole. On concealing the death of another, I sentence you to 10 years in confinement consecutive or after. Count one. Do you understand each of your sentences?
Yes, sir.
Even up until sentencing, Cortney didn't seem to understand that her actions, or lack thereof, contributed to the death of her daughter, and the judge really didn't have any kind words when trying to explain it.
Does your client wish to make any statements?
I didn't do this.
Stand up, stand up.
Y'all know I didn't do this.
Miss Bell, you and I had a conversation back in Chambers on Wednesday, remember, morning? And at the time I told you there's a difference between the reality of the situation and what you think. I explained to you exactly why you were being charged with the crimes. It wasn't that you knew about the murder, it wasn't that you anticipated the murder, it wasn't that you planned the murder, any of those things. It was simply that you created an environment that caused your children to be put second and Mr. McNabb to be put first. As the state said in their closing, and they used the example of a rattlesnake being thrown into a room and the child being put into there. Well, your whole claim is I took him back because I wanted to have a family. In that analogy the state used, it's just kind of like saying your child's dead from a rattlesnake bite. Why would you put it in there? And you responded, well, I just wanted her to enjoy nature, have an appreciation of the outdoors, without appreciating the danger. Now, I'm sorry, but for you to go around chasing McNabb, doing meth, flies in the face of what any normal mother would do. We hear stories out in society, I mean out everywhere. The mother bear They're so ferocious. Why? Because you're messing with their child. All those kind of things. And you chose methamphetamine and McNabb over a baby.
It's a sickness, but I tried to be a good mama. I love my babies.
The problem, Miss McNabb, is that, like most criminals, you have this version of what a good mama is that is so far from the norm that, you know, you go anywhere in this county, talk to anybody who's watching this and say, is it a good mama who doesn't even care about her 14-year-old baby? Put them with a cousin. I've known of instances where mamas won't even let in the first couple of weeks of a child's life people around the child for fear that the child's immune system hadn't been built up and they don't want germs brought into the child. They go to that extent. You went just the exact opposite direction. And there's just no excuse for that. Well, let's talk about this. Count 2 merges with count 1.
Yes, Judge.
What's the thought about count 3?
I think it's fine, Judge. It does not merge.
Okay. On count 1, I'm going to sentence you with 30 years, with the first 15 years to be served in confinement in the state penitentiary, the remaining time on probation.
So, as with most cases, both Chris and Cortney would of course go on to appeal their convictions. During Chris's appeal in 2022, he argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial and did not exclude other reasonable explanations for Caliyah's death. However, the Supreme Court upheld his conviction, and he continues to serve out his sentence of life without parole at Hays State Prison in Tryon, Georgia. As for Cortney, you might be surprised to learn that in 2022, the State Court of Appeals ruled that the prosecution failed to provide sufficient evidence for a jury to find her guilty of a second-degree murder charge and second-degree cruelty to children. In a 39-page ruling, they wrote, "There was no evidence presented that Cortney directly caused the victim cruel and excessive pain by inflicting blunt force trauma, caused someone else to commit the act, aided or abetted in the act, or that she advised, encouraged, hired, counseled, or procured someone to commit the act. There was nothing to exclude the reasonable possibility when the victim was taken from the home and or killed, and there was nothing in her actions before, during, or after the victim's disappearance and death from which the jury could make such an inference." However, the court upheld her conviction on the felony charge of contributing to the dependency of a minor, stating that there was evidence that Cortney's conduct in the days leading up to Caliyah's death, such as doing meth and leaving the children around a volatile Chris McNabb, played a substantial part in her death, and that death was a reasonably probable consequence of that neglect. In 2023, Cortney's legal team worked to appeal the rest of her conviction by taking the remaining dependency of a minor charge to the Supreme Court. In summary, they ruled that Cortney's choice to continue living with Chris McNabb despite his violence was not enough evidence to conclude that Caliyah's death was foreseeable. In a statement, the Supreme Court wrote, "We conclude, based on the fact of this case, that the evidence was insufficient to authorize a jury to conclude that Caliyah's death was not proximately caused by Cortney's conduct as alleged in the indictment, and we reverse the judgment of the court's appeals." Due to this decision, Cortney was released from prison. So that's where we're at with this case, and I'd really like to know what your thoughts are on Cortney being released. There's many people who agree that Cortney shouldn't have been charged with second-degree murder, but that she did need to be held accountable for prioritizing her relationship with Chris above the safety of her children. I think the analogy the prosecution used to describe it is perfect. If you leave your toddler around a rattlesnake, you have to know there is a risk that they can get bit, and more than likely will. There are so many people who struggle to get pregnant, and who would do anything to become parents. And then there are people like Chris and Cortney, who start pawning their baby off just days after she leaves the hospital. We all know that drug addiction is a lifelong battle that can really cloud a parent's judgment. However, when you bring a child into this world, it becomes your responsibility as an adult to do everything in your power to break the cycle of addiction and abuse. Children deserve the best chance at life, and that means making tough choices, seeking help, and prioritizing their well-being above everything else. It's about stepping up and being the protector they need, and it's really tragic that Chris and Cortney were too selfish to do that for Caliyah. That's going to be it for this video, and I know it was a hard one. But like I mentioned before, it's important to honor Caliyah by telling her story, and hopefully it can act as a wake-up call to any parent in a similar situation, to get out before it's too late. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.